In this lesson, we'll learn about nonverbal communication, one of my favorite lessons, favorite chapters. In our lesson today, we'll learn about the nature of nonverbal communication, pretty much a straightforward definition of what it is. And then we'll look at the channels, the various ways, and there's 10 channels in which verbal communication is enacted. We'll look at the effects and influences that communication has, or rather culture, sex, and nonverbal. Next, we'll look at the effect that culture and sex have on nonverbal communication. And then finally, we'll look at some tactics and strategies for improving your nonverbal communication skills in our ongoing series on enhancing our communication competence. Now, first, let's go and get a definition out of the way. Nonverbal communication can be defined as behaviors and characteristics that convey meaning, pretty straightforward, that convey meaning without the use of words. Nonverbal communication behaviors frequently accompany verbal messages to clarify and to reinforce them, and other nonverbal communication behaviors convey meaning on their own. Nonverbal communication is present in most, you might even say all, interpersonal communications. Whether you talk to people one-on-one or in a group, you have access not only to the words they speak, but also to several dimensions of nonverbal communication or nonverbal behavior. In many situations, you can watch people's facial expressions for signs of how they're feeling. For example, you might tell from someone's facial expression that your friend or your boss or your manager is bored at lunch and eager to leave. Voice also conveys data about a person's state of mind. At a party or a social gathering, for example, you can determine from the tone of someone else's voice when your host is being serious, it's really time to leave, or when she's kidding. It's nice. You got to go. Even when people dress and smell, even the way that people dress, rather, and the way they smell can send you information. Glancing around the room at a large business event, for example, you might be able to guess which people are managers, or which people are the boss, and which are staff or frontline employees by the formality of their clothing and the way other people act and react to them. Now, nonverbal communication, a couple tenets here, characteristics, is often conveys more information than nonverbal communication. The most likely reason why nonverbal communication adds up to such a significant percentage is that it makes use of many other nonverbal channels, not just your voice and the words. Now, these are obviously the various behavioral forms that nonverbal communication takes, and we're going to look at those throughout the remainder of this lecture. Nonverbal communication is usually more believable, and is believed over verbal communication. Now, experts think that we put more trust in how you say it and your nonverbal behaviors and those cues because we think that people have a harder time controlling nonverbal signs, like they're nervous, than verbal ones. I'm not nervous, but you're shaking. Thus, we assume that nonverbal behaviors are more accurate and they reflect more accurately what a person is really thinking or feeling. And finally, nonverbal communication is the primary means of communicating emotion. This is actually the last one, I'm sorry. Nonverbal communication also is a form of meta communication, communicating about communication. Now remember from the first lesson about communication that meta communication is communication about communication and that we often meta communicate verbally. We often use nonverbal behavior such as facial expressions as a way we communicate and gestures to further indicate how someone else should be interpreting our message. Now, nonverbal communication serves several functions. I'm just going to run through a list of how nonverbal comm affects and serves several different functions almost simultaneously. First, it helps us manage conversations. Even though conversations involve the exchange of verbal communication, we use several nonverbal behaviors to help our conversation, to help the flow with others go smoothly. In particular, nonverbal communication cues assist us in inviting, maintaining, and ending conversations. And I'll give you a couple examples. Like if you were to put your hand up and gesture to someone, this tells them, hold on, I'm not finished making my point yet, without you having to say, hold on, I'm not finished making my point yet. This serves the same function. Next, expressing emotion. The fact that many nonverbal human behaviors communicate information about emotional states means that interpreting another person's emotions can give us important clues about how to best interact with that person. The two most expressive nonverbal communication channels for emotion are your face, not surprising, and your vocal behaviors like your tone. Nonverbal communication can also help us form impressions. Or rather, let me get to that in a second. Nonverbal communication can also help us maintain relationships. It plays a central role in how most of us maintain our close and as well as our intimate relationships, and nonverbal behaviors are especially important for several key features of those relationships. Things like attraction, affiliation, power, dominance, and arousal, as well as relaxation. Now we can look at how it helps us form impressions. Many of us enjoy watching people watching. I just like to sit and watch people. Say sitting in a coffee shop or maybe at a parade or a nightclub or a bar. Now we pay attention to what individuals, like we go to the state fair, we like to just watch people. We pay attention to what people look like and sound like and how they behave, and we use that information to form impressions about them. Those impressions are also strongly affected by people's nonverbal behaviors. In particular, nonverbal cues influence two general types of impressions. Those are related to a person's demographic characteristics, as well as those related to a person's SES, socioeconomic status, or sociocultural characteristics. Nonverbal behavior or nonverbal communication also serves the function of influencing others. You probably find yourselves in many situations in which you wish to influence other people's behaviors. In other words, you can use nonverbal behaviors to influence others. These can be persuasive when it applied to as part of several strategies, including maybe creating credibility and promoting affiliation. For instance, I might wear glasses and a suit if I wanted to give the impression that I'm more professional than just wearing a North Face jacket and not even shaving for a few days. Finally, concealing information. A final function of nonverbal behavior is to help people conceal information to hide their true feelings. Despite the cultural adage that honesty is the best policy, people frequently decide not to be entirely truthful in their conversations with others, and we can often use nonverbal behavior or nonverbal communication to help hide the true intent of a message. Now, continuing our look at the 10 channels of nonverbal communication, we'll look at the facial displays. Facial displays are particularly important in three arenas, and it's hard to overstate the importance of these displays. In nonverbal communication, the principle of facial primacy is where the face communicates more information than any other channel of nonverbal behavior. That principle is especially true for three important functions of facial displays. We're going to look at each one of these: identity, attractiveness, and emotion. First, identity. Identity, the face is the most important visual cue that we have and that we use to identify one another. Not rocket science there. Now, attractiveness is the other facial display. The face also plays a major role in attractiveness as well. Even though we like to think that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, there is a remarkable consistency across cultures in terms of what people find attractive in the face, both within our culture it's almost universally culturally true as well. Two properties that we're going to look at that appear to be especially important in assessing attractiveness. First is symmetry. Symmetry refers to the similarity between the left and the right side of the face. For most of us, the two sides of the face look similar, but they aren't exactly alike on both halves of the face. Now, for both women and men, attractive faces have greater symmetry, or said differently, we tend to find symmetrical faces much more attractive. And I'll give you two examples that I probably should have put a picture of. Think about Lyle Lovett. Go Google a picture of Lyle Lovett if you need to. That dude's face is not symmetrical. Amazing artist, but that dude's face is not symmetrical. You want to see a symmetrical face, go look at Denzel Washington. Denzel Washington, his face is nearly perfect symmetry. Lyle Lovett's face, not too symmetrical. The next is proportionality. It refers to the relative size of one's facial features, like a nose or an ear being too big. We tend to like people with ears, nose, eyes, mouth, etc. in proportion with the rest of their noggin. Also, emotion. Facial display helps us convey emotion. Now, recall from earlier discussions that nonverbal behaviors communicate emotions much more effectively and accurately than do verbal communications. Now, because the face is the major channel of nonverbal behavior, it's probably not surprising to learn that facial behavior is our primary means of communicating our emotions. Another channel of nonverbal communication is the eye. Eye behaviors are part of the face, obviously, and it might strike you as kind of odd that researchers who study eye behaviors separate from facial behaviors. So we might look at some research and some writing that looks at oculesics, eye behavior, and facial expression separately because the eyes are so powerful. Just as facial behavior communicates more than any other nonverbal channel, the eyes, to dive even deeper, communicate even more than any other part of the face. Thus, the specialists treat oculesics, the study of eye behavior, as a separate and distinct nonverbal communication channel, like a subset of the face. The next channel of nonverbal communication is gestures. This is the study of kinesics, and we'll look at some of the nonverbal gesture-related channels coming up next. Emblems, the first one, are any gesture that have a direct verbal translation. Whenever you see an emblematic gesture, you should be able to translate that into words. When you're waving hello or goodbye, and they're also culture related. So your peace sign is in the U.S. or North America has a direct emblematic translation to a certain concept. Next, illustrators. Remember, those are also culturally bound. Illustrators are gestures that go along with a verbal message to clarify it. If you hold up your hands to indicate a certain size of a fish you caught, it was this big. I caught a fish over the weekend. Where's my camera? It was this big. That is and illustrates the concept. That's a tiny fish too. It illustrates the concept that you're trying to convey. Next is an affect display. These are gestures that communicate emotion or affect or affection. Some people wring their hands when they say they're nervous. Some people cover their mouth with their hands when they're surprised. You tap your feet or wiggle your legs when you're nervous. These are affect displays because they coincide with particular emotions. Regulators are gestures that control the flow of conversation, and I alluded to one a few minutes ago. One regulator with which you're probably very familiar with is raising your hand when you're in a group when you wish to speak, or maybe holding your hand up to tell somebody you're not finished with your point just yet. That regulates the flow of conversations. Now, adapters are used to satisfy some personal needs, such as scratching an itch or picking lint off of your shirt. When we do these behaviors to ourselves, we call them self-adapters. When adapters are directed at others, say picking lint off to someone else's shirt, it's called other adapters. Another channel of nonverbal communication is called haptics, and that is the study of touch. Touch is the first of our five senses that we develop once we're born. Even before an infant can see, hear, taste, smell, his or her skin responds to stimuli in the environment. It's instantaneous. Touch is the only sense without which we cannot survive. No matter how much we may cherish our other senses, it is entirely possible to survive without being able to see, hear, touch, taste, or smell. But if you lost the sense of touch, we would be constantly susceptible to burns, frostbite, other potentially life-threatening injury. Like you wouldn't even realize that a dog is gnawing off your toes. Now, haptics is the study of how we use touch to communicate. In terms of human communication, though, there are five major areas that we're going to look at in which touch plays a critical role in conveying meaning. The first is affectionate touch. Sharing affection is one of the most important functions of behaviors. Behaviors such as hugging, kissing, hand-holding communicate love, intimacy, and commitment. Next is caregiving touch. Now, you're often touched by others when receiving some type of care or service. I don't have any hair, so I haven't gotten a haircut in 20 years, but you are being touched when you get a haircut, for example. That is a caregiving touch. Power and touch control. Touch is sometimes used to exert power over other people's behavior, such as putting your hand on the small of someone's back to guide them gently into a particular direction. That is a control type of touch. Then you have some of your darker elements. You have your aggressive touch. These are the touch that's designed to inflict physical harm or pain, punching, pushing, kicking, slapping, etc. Those are forms of aggressive touch. And then finally, not that this is necessarily one of the dark sides, realistic ritualistic touch. Some touches are ritualistic, meaning that we do them as part of a custom or a tradition. In North America, for example, shaking hands is one example of ritualistic touch. When we shake hands with people, it's just a greeting. And we understand that the handshake does not necessarily convey any particular meaning about the relationship. We're just using it as a ritual type of greeting. Another channel of nonverbal communication is vocalics. Now, perhaps you have a high, breathy, screechy voice. Maybe you have a James Earl Jones type of booming voice. Maybe you talk very fast or quite loudly or quite quietly. Perhaps you have an accent that includes signs of where you grew up. These are all times when you speak with a particular tone of voice that suggests you are irritated, amused, or bored, and refer to all these types as characteristics that are collectively known as vocalics. We also refer to them sometimes as paralanguage, meaning beside the language, to indicate that they do go along with the words we speak to convey meaning. And we're going to look at some of those paralanguage types of vocalics. The first is pitch. Pitch of the voice is an index, that's pitchy dog, of how high or deep it sounds. Kind of a dated reference there. Every person's voice has an average fundamental frequency, which is the pitch one's voice hits most often. Next is inflection. The inflection in the voice refers to the variation in its pitch, the range of pitch that you have. Voices that have a great deal of inflection are usually described as very expressive, while those with little inflection are said to be monotone. Volume is next. Volume is the index of how loud or how quiet one's voice is. Most of us alter our vocal volume as the social context dictates, such as speaking quietly in the library or more loudly at a crowded conversation. Rate. The average adult speaks at approximately, I'll let you guess, 150 words a minute, but the individual might speak faster when excited or slower when unsure of himself or herself, or maybe they're trying to emphasize a point. Filler words, one of my favorite concepts. Filler words are non-word sounds, such as like, you know what I'm saying, that many people use to fill silence between pauses when they're speaking. If we have to pause while speaking to remember the words we want to use next, we use filler words during the pause to indicate that we intend to continue. So it's a way we regulate the conversation. It's a sign to the other person not to jump in because I'm not finished talking yet. That pause is when somebody else might jump in, but we fill that pause with a sound to indicate to the other person we're not finished yet. Articulation and pronunciation. There we go. Articulation or enunciation refers to how clearly one speaks. People who mumble or speak with their mouth full of food demonstrate poor articulation. In contrast, people whose words are clear and easily understandable are good at articulation. Accent. An accent is a pattern of pronunciation, vowels and consonant sounds that is representative of a particular language or geographic area. Everyone speaks with an accent, whether you think you don't hear your accent, but other people do. Even if you think you have the perfectly generic Midwestern accent, that to someone in the Northeast or the Southeast is an accent to them. Finally, silence. Silence is the absence of sound, and we frequently use silence to convey meaning in conversations. For example, when we become silent when we are unsure of how to respond to a question, or when we have said as much as we wish to say about a topic, we often stop talking. And the next channel of nonverbal communication is olfactics. Olfactics is a study of smell. And this is really interesting, this slide here, so pay attention because this has got some interesting concepts around things like sexual attraction. Now, of all the channels of nonverbal behavior, you might have the hardest time figuring out what smell has to do with human communication and human behavior. Now, it turns out that your sense of smell, olfactics, operates very subtly, but very powerfully as well to influence your reactions to others in two very phenomenal areas that are central to human experience and communication: our memory and our smell. Think about, I'll give you an example. When I've lived in DFW since the mid-'80s, and I remember driving up 75 in Dallas, not often because I live in Fort Worth, but driving up 75, the Mrs. Baird's factory. Or was it the tollway? See, I can't even remember now. Is it tollway? 75. No, 75. 75 near SMU, there used to be the Mrs. Baird's bread factory. And you could drive by that Mrs. Baird's bread factory every day, and you would always smell fresh baked bread. Now, every time I smell fresh baked bread, regardless of where I am, grocery store, Central Market, at the house, I'm always taken back to driving up and down 75 and smelling Mrs. Baird's. It's that key because I believe the part of the brain that processes smell and the part of the brain that processes memory are so physically close together inside your brain. So there's the memory part of it. It helps you associate memories with a smell. And the next one is sexual attraction. Smell also affects our communication by playing a role in determining who we are sexually attracted to. Although you may think of sexual attraction as being driven mostly by visual cues, whether you think of an individual looks attractive and fertile, in fact, your judgments about a person's sexual attractiveness are strongly affected also by the way he or she smells. This is where it gets really trippy and interesting. More specifically, some of the research that's out there tells us that when we are looking for opposite sex romantic partners, this goes back to your genetics and your DNA of being Homo sapiens, we are drawn to people whose natural body scent is the most different from our own. Listen to this. Why is that? Because the research tells us if two people have very similar scents, we've determined that their genes are also similar to ours. And that similarity can increase the probability of producing genetically abnormal children. People produce much healthier children when they mate with partners who are genetically dissimilar and they smell different to them. And it happens that a person's natural body scent sends a signal to the brain that tells you how similar his or her genes are to yours. And if they smell like you, it tells you that your genes are similar to them and you might have some messed up kids. Now, the next channel of nonverbal communication is proxemics. Proxemics is how we use space to communicate. When we interact socially, we constantly negotiate our use of space. That behavior becomes particularly apparent when our personal space is limited, like in a bus. Think of being in a crowded elevator or, again, a bus or a plane. Why do so many of us find situations like that to be uncomfortable? The scientific study of spatial use is known as proxemics and explains that each of us has a preferred amount of personal space that we carry like a little bitty invisible bubble around us. Now, in Western cultures, people use 4 spatial zones as indicated by this image. I'm just going to build them out here for you. There we go. 4 spatial zones when interacting with others. In your intimate distance, which occurs in 0 to approximately 18 inches, a foot and a half out, that's the zone we willingly occupy with our closest and most intimate family, friends, and our romantic partners. Now, when other friends and relatives, we typically maintain this personal distance, which is described as extending from a foot and a half to about 4 feet. Customers in our place of business, or when we go out and we are the customers, we don't mind these people that we don't know very well occupying this foot and a half to 4 feet range. That's our social. That's our personal distance. Now, next is our social distance. That ranges from 4 feet to 12 feet, and conveys more formal, impersonal interaction. And then finally, public distance typically applies when someone is giving a speech or performing in front of a large audience. Public distance is usually 12 feet to 25 feet or greater, depending on the circumstance. Now, physical appearance is the next channel of nonverbal communication, and that's the study of how we send messages, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Whether we intend to or not, we make all sorts of judgments about people on the basis of how they look. In particular, we have a strong predisposition to attribute positive qualities. Listen to this. We have a strong, innate, hardwired DNA predisposition to attribute positive qualities to attractive people, and a tendency that researchers refer to as the halo effect. That's the halo effect, the habit that we have of attributing positive qualities to attractive people. And in other words, when a person looks good, most of us subconsciously assume that he or she is a good person as well. The next channel of nonverbal communication is chronemics. Chronemics is the way we use time to communicate. You might not immediately think of time usage as a type of nonverbal behavior, but the way we give or refuse to give our time to others can send them important messages about the way we feel about them. I'm not going to show up on time to any event, or I'm not going to show up on time to this person's dinner because I don't really want to be there, so I'm going to show up late and leave early. Because most of us spend our time on the people and activities that matter to us, the way we use time communicates messages about what we value. When we give our time to others, we imply that we value those people. Our use of time also sends messages about power, right? When you go to see someone who is in a position of power over you, such as your boss or you're going on a job interview, it is not uncommon to be kept waiting. However, you would probably consider it bad form to make more powerful people wait on you. Probably not a good idea. The next thing we're going to look at is the influence. Now, those are the 10 forms or the 10 ways that nonverbal behavior affects our communication. Next, let's look at the effect that culture and sex have on nonverbal communication. Culture influences nonverbal communication in several ways. These are nonverbal behaviors that are shaped by the cultural practices within which people are raised. The first is emblems. The specific messages that an emblem symbolizes often vary by culture. Come here gesture, commonly used in the U.S., means goodbye in China. And gestures such as an A-OK or thumbs up sign tends to have a sexual or obscene gesture in other parts of the world. I'll let you leave this to your imagination what that could probably mean in other parts of the country. Part of the world. Next is affect displays. Some displays of affect or emotion are specific to certain cultures. In China, for example, women express emotional satisfaction by holding their fingertips over their closed mouths. Similarly, a man in Uruguay will hold his fists together and turn them in opposite directions as if wringing on a wet cloth to express anger. Next, personal distance. People from Arab countries generally converse with each other at much closer distances than U.S. cultures or North American cultures. One study found that because of differences in their preferred conversational distance, Arab college students regarded those from the U.S. as aloof, whereas U.S. students, American students, regarded these Arab students as overbearing because they're so close. The next cultural influence on nonverbal communication is eye contact. In many Western cultures, direct eye contact signifies that you're interested, you're sincere, and you're trustworthy, and you're authoritative. In comparison, in some Asian, Latin American, and Middle Eastern countries, lack of eye contact is a sign of deference or respect or authority. Next is facial displays. They're a way we display emotion. Now, decades of research indicate that people around the world express emotions, particularly primary emotions such as happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, and disgust, in highly similar ways. Now, what tends to differ across cultures is how expressive people are of emotion. With those in individualistic cultures, we learned about that in prior lessons. Now, what tends to differ across cultures is how expressive people are of emotion. With those in individualistic cultures, we learned about that previously, routinely being more emotionally expressive than those in collectivistic cultures. Next, greeting behavior. People in Western cultures typically greet social acquaintances with a handshake, whereas people in, say, Mediterranean cultures typically kiss each other on both cheeks. And in Asian cultures, it is common to greet others by bowing, with the longest and lowest bows reserved for the most respected individuals. Next, time orientation. As you recall from the culture and gender chapter previously, the uses of time vary from culture to culture. Some cultures, including the U.S., Canada, as well as Finland, Great Britain, and Germany, are very monochronic, meaning that they see time as tangible commodity. It is time as money, and expect events to begin on time. If you're not 5 minutes early, you're 5 minutes late, and dislike having their time wasted. Other cultures, France, Brazil, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, are polychronic, meaning multiple fluid interpretations of time, and they see time as flexible and diffused and don't necessarily expect or give punctuality. Next is haptics, and we can go back to the concepts of what haptics means. People in high context culture France, Mexico, Greece touch each other significantly more often than do people in low contact cultures, such as Japan, Sweden, and Finland. High contact cultures are also characterized by less personal space and than do low contact cultures. Now, research indicates in our text that the U.S. is most accurately defined as a medium, right in the middle, as a medium contact type of culture. And then finally, vocalics. Besides their readily noticeable differences in accents, cultures also differ in their use of filler words, like are common filler words in the English language. Now, Chinese speakers use a clearly different filler word, and this translates differently, and different cultures use different filler words. Obviously, Chinese, French, German, they're not going to use and like. They have their own unique, culturally bound filler words. Continuing our conversation of how culture and sex influence our nonverbal behavior is the way that sex influences nonverbal behavior as well. Now, a second major influence is a person's sex. Women and men sometimes react very differently to different nonverbal stimuli. And they react differently with different degrees to the same situation. And we'll look at a few of those right now. Emotional expressiveness. Several studies document that women are more expressive than are men with respect to a variety of emotional states, such as joy, affection, fear, and shame. Eye contact. When communicating with others of the same sex, women engage in more eye contact than do men, a difference that has been demonstrated in both the U.S. as well as Japan. In fact, female pairs use higher amounts of gaze, G-A-Z-E, than do male pairs when speaking, while listening, and even during silence. Personal space. Go back to that concept we covered a few minutes ago. In comparison to men, women are approached more closely, give way more readily to others, stand and sit closer to each other, and tolerate more quote-unquote violations of their personal space. In opposite sex interactions, men are more likely to violate women's space more so than women are to violate men's personal space. Vocalics. On average, men's voices have a lower average pitch than do women's. Not a surprise there. And the primary reason why that is that men have a larger voice box. It's physiological, and longer vocal cords, which produce the sound of the voice than do women, as a result of physiological changes that occur during our growth periods. Now, research indicates that men also use more filler words and pauses as a way to control the conversation when they speak than do women. Touch. Among adults, men are more likely to touch women than women are likely to touch men, unless that touch is occurring as part of a greeting, such as maybe a handshake. In same-sex pairs, however, women touch each other more than do men, although the sex difference is smaller in close, intimate relationships than among acquaintances. And finally, appearance. Sex differences in appearance are also influenced by culture as well. Moreover, women and men typically adorn themselves in noticeably different ways. In Western cultures, for example, cosmetic use is significantly more common for women, it's a shocker here, than it is for men. I can't tell you the last time I put on makeup. Also, women and men usually wear different styles of clothing and jewelry and adopt different hairstyles, and these conventions further accentuate and differentiate our appearances. Now, in our continuing conversation around creating competent communicators, we need to look at and develop a better understanding of how to use nonverbal behaviors appropriately. Sensitivity. The first way is to improve your nonverbal communication skills. We need to get better at interpreting nonverbal communication. Sensitivity to such nonverbal behaviors is important because we can't interpret messages unless we first take note of them. Although some of the research that we'll read about indicates that some people are more non-verbally sensitive by nature than others, you may be able to increase your nonverbal sensitivity through mindful awareness, such as when you're interacting with someone, even online. Let's try some of these approaches. First, be sensitive to nonverbal messages and remind yourself that as much as 2/3 of a person's communication is being conveyed through nonverbal behaviors. Decipher the meaning of nonverbal messages. Pay particular attention to facial expressions or signs of what he or she is feeling, and remember that the face communicates more emotion than other nonverbal communication channels. And take note of people's tone of voice and body movements, because these behaviors are particularly relevant for signaling dominance as well as deception. Thank you for listening to this chapter on nonverbal communication.